are back on the Zero Hour. I am, as always, your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Last week we did a couple of hours of remembrance of David Graeber, the anthropologist, writer, and activist who tragically died last week at the age of 59. I played a couple of our extended interviews with David. I talked about David. I also wrote an essay about David that was published a few days ago. And joining me now to talk further about the legacy of David Graeber is someone I've actually wanted to meet, if this is considered a meeting, for a long time. Andrew Wolf is, I'm sorry, Andrew Ross. I just did an hour shift there. Andrew Ross is a professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU. He is also a very prolific and significant writer on much of the topics we follow on this program. So I won't go into his bibliography here, but it's well worth checking out. And he is the author of a remembrance of David Graeber in the New York Review of Books. So he joins us now. So first of all, Andrew Ross, sorry for the long and slightly tangled introduction, and welcome to the Zero Hour.
Pleasure to be with you.
So I can't tell you how much I appreciated your essay on David. It was part of several people did essays on him in the New York Review of Books last week. But I would say, I have two thoughts about David in the context of your short essay. One is that, I continue to believe that David was one of the most important thinkers of our time. And certainly, the description of your work together reinforces that. And secondly, I just love the anecdote about finding him in a vintage clothing store in London's Portobello Road, where he was trying on a fur coat. I would venture to say that Herbert Marcuse probably never tried on a fur coat. Maybe he did, I don't know. But I think one of the things I so appreciate about David was his combination of intellectual daring and joy and fun. So I don't know, any opening thoughts on those two sides of David, or anything else you want to talk about?
Well, I mentioned that anecdote because, and it seems as if other people who've written remembrances of David over the last week have also noted his zeal for dressing up, and I put it in the context of political theater. He understood how political theater can and should work, and it was part of his contribution to the various activist movements which he either participated in or generated from his own model and his own thinking. And there's a lot to talk about there. I was fortunate enough to have been able to participate with him on one or two of these campaigns and groups. And in addition, of course, I'm a great fan of his writing, and I've always used his writing, and really appreciate that. I'm a scholar too, and a scholar activist, but I appreciate that David really, when he wrote books, he always wrote useful books. And there's a lot of useless books out there. I've written a few of them myself. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean it quite literally, books that aren't used very often. And the commitment to writing a book that can be used and should be used is a very particular craft and a very particular genre, which David really excelled at. And I think accounts for the very wide range of audiences that he garnered in his lifetime, and will continue to garner even after his tragic death. There's something for everyone in his corpus, and you really do get your money's worth when you pick up a written text by David Graeber.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that observation, and I think it points to the mathematician talk about elegance, right? The idea that you can express complex ideas mathematically in very simple terms. E equals mc squared, that kind of thing, right? Elegance, simplicity in communicating a complex and very new idea. And I think David's writing had elegance. I think that's part, to me, of what made it useful is that, and in the way that you describe, is that he could take something like, I actually can't use George Carlin's 9 prohibited words because we're broadcast on radio, but David's BS jobs, shall we say, his book, Bull Blank Jobs, a Theory. One of the reasons why it caught on was, in my view, was because that phrase was so easy to understand. You hear the phrase, you immediately have a strong sense of what he's talking about. And then he can take an idea like that and express it in language that is not, you don't need to be part of the priestly class of academia to wade your way through. Is that kind of part of what you're talking about?
Yes, it is. And I think that book's a good example. And I want to just underline, however, in addition that, David was a committed anarchist, and but he wasn't a doctrinaire or anarchist in the sense in which he was always, pounding anarchist theory and principles at you, whether as a writer or as a speaker. He found more artful ways of communicating those, bedrock anarchist principles. Anarchists write a lot of books. If you ever go to an anarchist book fair, it's overflowing with literature, and most of the books are fairly dry, right. Expositions of basic anarchist principles. David didn't write like that, and so he was always looking for topics and treatments of topics that would in some way communicate basic anarchist principles like self-organization or consensus or mutual aid, just to mention 3. And the book that you mentioned, the book about jobs, I think it's been very important because it was obviously written before the pandemic, right. But emerged in the course of the pandemic was this realization that the so-called essential workers were doing care work. They were feeding us and they were looking after us. And when they weren't doing that, everyone else was doing the same, looking after each other and thinking about feeding. And in other words, the most important things. And so that's an economy that is an economy of mutual aid. Care work is the economy of mutual aid, and it's something that's very close to any anarchist's heart. It's self-organized for the most part. By contradistinction, the people who are doing the BS jobs,
right,
collar jobs and finance or PR or consulting, the kind of jobs which he argued in the book, it would make no difference to the world if they just disappeared or if people stopped doing them. These jobs were not being done for the most part. And guess what? It made no difference. And so the pandemic economy really highlighted in many ways what the book had been arguing for everyone. And but the point I really want to make and come back to is that the underlying argument was an argument for mutual aid and care. And if the care economy does emerge as a central economy from the pandemic, then, we have a lot to thank David for these insights.
Oh, absolutely. And again, we're talking with Andrew Ross, professor at NYU, about the late anthropologist, writer, and activist, David Graeber. So we'll check out David's writing as well as Andrew's. And I guess that leads me to logically to David's activism and to David's passionate, to me, what struck me as passionate dedication to anarchism. People who who are considered anarchists or describe themselves as anarchists or, write about it or whatever, uh, come in a variety of flavors, it seems to me. And you mentioned the dryness of a lot of anarchist writing, which I've definitely found to be the case, um, as well as a breadth of different kinds of anarchists. But the one thing I got from David was a passion about about it, anarchism in its most radical sense, meaning its root sense, that people will self-organize, for mutual aid if they're given the freedom to do so. I mean, that being the macro view, and then the individual view being that, a passion to allow each person to lead the most fulfilling life possible, which to me was also a reflection of his form of anarchism. And I guess I would then, before turning it over to you, conclude by saying it's not that I agreed with him on every theoretical point necessarily, but I certainly connected with that passion and that sense of what the world he was trying to build. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I would agree with you. I mean, I'm not a doctrinaire kind of person myself. My politics are very miscellaneous, let's say. I mix my politics. I think there are contexts in which state action makes a lot of sense.
Right.
There are contexts in which self-organization makes a lot of sense. We can't, for example, we can't turn around the climate crisis without a lot of state action, it seems to me. Right. Self-organization helps, but state power can go a long way.
Right.
In addressing the climate crisis. So I'm kind of in favor of a mixed economy of the commons, the anarchist principles of the commons, and also public power. These are things you could obviously debate David about. He wasn't, dogmatic in that sense. But when it comes to the activism, which was really the point of your question, I think it's fair to say that anarchism has become a default mentality of most young people who've been involved in social movements for the last 20, 25 years or so. It's how they function, it's how they organize, they decide by consensus, and direct action is a major part of their movement mentality. And it's the direct action part that makes it quintessentially anarchist because, and I think David would agree with that, he used to argue about the big distinction, for example, between direct action and civil disobedience. Civil disobedience was very much the default mentality for a civil rights generation, even the New Left generation, putting your body on the line and opposing the authority of the state through civil disobedience. For someone like David, direct action is more appropriate because it simply does not recognize the state.
Right.
It's an autonomous, self-organized action that whose conduct is governed by the idea that the state does not exist and has no authority over me. And there's a big difference there. Obviously, it wasn't David alone who generated this mentality for young people, but he channeled it in very influential ways. And of course, the most influential was Occupy Wall Street, which really was his moment in a way, for all sorts of reasons.
So, and again, we're talking with Professor Andrew Ross about the late David Graeber. It seems to me that, in a way, David was, and I say this with great love and admiration, David in many ways might have been more at home in the 60s in a way that made him more valuable in the 21st century. Because it seems to me, as one who was a teenager during the 14, 15, but I went to the anti-war marches. I saw, experienced all of that. I had an older brother who worked with Abby Hoffman and all that sort of thing. So having observed a lot of that firsthand, it strikes me that the best moments and the most potential of that movement were lost. And I think one of the things I saw in David was an intellectual and a personal reinvigoration of that movement. For example, Abby Hoffman, who I met, spoke with at least a couple times. I saw a little bit of Abby and David. I saw both the playfulness, the kind of dress up, and like, although Abby was more of a statist in many ways, like Abby, there was a part, or rather, I should say, like David, Abby was also inclined to think people could spontaneously form organizations, movements, where I guess organizations is the wrong word, but movements and affiliations that could change the world. And I don't know, am I diminishing David in any way by comparing him to the 60s, or is there validity in your mind to the comparison?
Well, I think the difference with Hoffman really is, I mean, David was a writer and his writer, and his writing fed into the movement in all sorts of ways. Even his most scholarly production. One of the big distinctions, and it's been very important to me, is the difference of, just from a scholarly perspective, of doing advocacy research as opposed to militant research. I think most of my colleagues and a lot of journalists think that they consider themselves to doing advocacy work when they write. In other words, providing a voice for people who don't have a voice or who don't have access to the public realm in the same way as you can as a writer. In that kind of situation, you parachute in and you can leave. It's a sort of limited engagement advocacy research of that sort. What David pioneered in a way was militant research in which you're part of the movement. You're not embedded, you are an important part of the movement, and the research you're doing is on behalf of the movement. And it's solving or addressing problems that have occurred in the course of movement action. And to me, that was a very important model. And I've written a few books subsequently that draw upon that model. One of them was about my own involvement in the debt resistance movement. So that kind of writing, again, generates a particular line of inquiry that feeds into the movement. And that, I guess that would be the distinction I would draw between him and someone like Hoffman, who had obviously a very influential role, but was not, I think, Steal This Book did not amount to,
Right.
a great writing.
Although Abby did say, and I understand exactly, in a speech at your institution, he was one of the first people I know of to challenge the system of incarceration, mass incarceration in this country.
Okay.
And he said that includes a minimum security institution like NYU. That was his. So Abby had his thoughts, but I know what you mean. And in the sense that David was not, he was a polemicist in the sense that the 99% was a brilliant phrase that I think had massive impact on the debates. We had that gift, but in the sense that David was a thinker, an analyst, a generator of ideas who did so in a way that people could incorporate and understand. I think you're right. I love the distinction between activist and militant scholarship. I'm going to reflect on that more. But what went along with that was the strong sense I got from him and from what others have said about him, that he was genuinely egalitarian about it. And that was my experience speaking with him, whether it was in an interview or otherwise. He really felt he was part of a body of people greater than himself, didn't he? And that in that sense, he was, I don't know if he used the word comrade, but a comrade among comrades. Isn't that a fair observation?
Yes, yeah, I would agree. He was not a modest person, but he was egalitarian,
Right.
and very gregarious. which helps a lot in activist circles. I mean, my own personal involvement with him in that regard was in debt resistance movements that grew up around Occupy and out of Occupy. He had serendipitously published this paradigm-shattering book on debt, the
Right.
first 5,000 years, and it came out just before Occupy. And debt and debt resistance was a frontline preoccupation of Occupy Wall Street. And so it fed directly into that. I was one of the founders of the Occupy Student Debt Campaign. And in the early, I guess the first month of Occupy, and David had left New York at that time. He wasn't physically in New York, but he was a big supporter and consultant on the campaign. And when he came back to New York in the summer, the following summer, 2012, Occupy Wall Street was beginning to fall apart, largely because of ruthless oppression by police forces across the country. That's often neglected as an important factor in the devolution of Occupy Wall Street. So when David came back, a lot of the talents and energies from Occupy went into the formation of Strike Debt. And over the course of that summer, we focused on trying to produce two very practical projects. Useful, as I said at the beginning of our interview, but also practical. And those were the Debt Resistors Operations Manual and the Rolling Jubilee, both of which David was heavily involved in and helped to frame, and was a egalitarian cooperator, part of the collective. And so we really forged a relationship really during these months around those projects.
And again, we're talking with Professor Andrew Ross about the late anthropologist David Graeber. I hate to say that, late anthropologist, but I was thinking as we were talking, Andrew, that I hadn't really thought about this until now, but David was delighted to hear that I was involved in student debt activism myself. But it occurs to me now in reflection, most of my work has been in that area, has with others, and I work with a group on that, but has been focused on, first of all, raising public awareness, which we're all trying to do, but secondly, on legislative, political persuasion, Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar and their bills, and so on. But it strikes me that Strike Debt and some of the other projects David and David were involved in were more aligned with the idea of, not that, I mean, I support what I've done, but that we're more focused, perhaps from that anarchist perspective of people can address this problem themselves. We don't need state benevolence. And that's why the buying of, raising money and buying debt, even as a symbolic act, is, maybe a way of saying, you have nothing to lose but your chains, and we can do this together. So, in my view, they're complementary. In my view, it's an inside-outside strategy. But I never thought about it until you and I began talking that maybe that's what attracted David in particular to this form of self-organizing activity, collectives and organizations of that kind. What do you think?
Well, I think you raise a very interesting question, because with Strike Debt, the Strike Debt projects were mostly about mutual aid and self-organization. People taking their own initiative to reduce their debt burden, or entering it as a Rolling Jubilee did. We bought up debt on the secondary debt market and abolished it.
Right.
It was purely an act of mutual aid and a proof of concept that collective organization could produce results. And that principle that collective organization produces results, we took a lot further with the formation of the Debt Collective, which you have worked with, I believe, some of this legislation, College for All legislation. And what happened with the Debt Collective was we started again after strike debt kind of devolved. We started very small and very local and focused on student debt and found student debtors who had been who'd been scammed basically by foreign universities. They had no organizing experience. We helped them organize in the form of a debt strike, and initiated the filing of claims with the Department of Education for the abolition of their debt, right, the discharge of debt. And the claims mounted and overall have resulted in the recognition on the part of the Department of Education that more than $1 billion worth of debt, so far at least, should be discharged. It hasn't all been discharged because the current Secretary of Education is a bit of an obstacle. But that is an example, and David was supportive of that, although perhaps there's a part of him, the anarchist part, which would say, why are you spending so much time engaging the state?
Right. And that's, and yet in a funny way, as I think about it now, my work with groups like, Freedom to Prosper or what have you, with the Bernie Sanders team and the Ilhan Omar team, was based on a position that is both less radical and more radical, perhaps, in a way. Less radical in that, from an anarchist perspective, I'm enjoining the state to be, to be altruistic. I'm begging for something that people should not have to beg for. But on the other hand, more radical in that I think that all student debt is bad student debt. All student debt is deceptively, it's a broken bargain between society and its members. So you could argue I'm on both sides of that, but I would prefer to argue that there are complementary approaches. But I think what David did for someone like me in terms of thinking is he introduced me or he deepened my awareness of another way of looking at things, and that's informed and changed my thought process in a lot of ways. And sometimes when I think about David's version of anarchism, I think of Ella Baker, the civil rights leader, who was not an anarchist herself, but who said a strong people don't need strong leaders. And I do agree with that. So I'm trying to think now, Andrew Ross, whether there's some dimension of David's life we should address before I let you go. We've talked about his professorship. We've talked about his activism. I guess, to me, I would close with this. You mentioned that David, was, a good self-regard, a healthy self-regard. He was not, he was aware of his own abilities, I think. But I think he was aware in a way that I've only experienced in truly brilliant people, which is he was so aware that he had I was never conscious that he felt he needed to prove himself in any way. It led to an extreme openness. I mean, I remember one time on the air, we both used the phrase, the war against the imagination. And I said, well, it comes from a poem by Diane de Prima. Really? He said, can you send me that poem afterwards? And most people, even bright people, would be might have been a little defensive about that. Either I knew that or it's not important. But David's enthusiasm for information from every source overrode the kind of self-presentation that a lot of people feel they need to have in this world. I don't know if you agree with that observation or not, but that was my sense of him.
Yeah, I do agree, and I'm trying to think of an angle that would highlight it. And I think I'd really start maybe from the university, the scholarship. If you free yourself from the reward system that is ever present in higher education and in the academic profession, if you really don't care about the rewards that are on offer, which are, you know, there to institutionally police your speech and your output. And I think David fairly early on decided he didn't care about any of that, and would do and say what he did in disregard of that whole system, which is highly hierarchical. I think that is very liberating for certain kinds of people. It's professionally suicidal for others. But for someone like David, I think it not only brought out the best in him, but also was very true to his principles, which were very, you know, anti-hierarchical and anti-authoritarian and so on and so forth. And if you live up to those, then that can take you, that can give you a passport to a lot of different domains of activity and a lot of different audiences. And I think that's what David did. One way of putting that is to talk about being a public intellectual, but I don't think that's the profile that I would place David Graeber in. I'm not sure there's a very useful term for describing what he did and what he wrote, but he certainly is a model for many of us who try to follow some of those lines of inquiry and fashion similar codes of conduct in activism and scholarship and writing.
Absolutely. And as you said, you know, many people are saying they're indebted to him for his contributions, but he would he would not appreciate the idea that we're ensnared in a mutual indebtedness. I think he would prefer to say we were connected by principles of mutual aid, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Andrew Ross, professor at NYU, writer, and I won't say public intellectual, but militant scholar, perhaps. Thank you so much for your remembrance of David Graeber, and thanks for coming on the program to talk about it.
Thank you for having me on.
And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.